Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
I am pleased to welcome you back to our program from last week. Our guest again is Dr. Lisa Carlson. We had a wonderful program last week with dealing with the historical issues in the foreign policy of the United States. We're going to continue that, and we're going to relate that to the great threat that we've had and are continuing to have concerning terrorist networks around the world. Our guest holds a BA degree in international relations from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and she holds a master's and a PhD, both from Rice University. As I've indicated, her expertise is international relations and international questions. Dr. Carlson, welcome back. We had a great time because you're so informed. It's so a pleasure to interview someone who has great knowledge. It makes it easier for our guests to, and us both, and also for our viewers to learn so much. Again, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to be here.
And as always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and I shall invite Janelle to start today's questioning.
Dr. Carlson, you are very well versed and very knowledgeable about foreign affairs, and one of the things that's happening right now is terrorism, and that seems to be taking a great toll on our country as well as on other countries around the world. Can you tell us, to help us better understand something about terrorism, what are some of the causes of terrorism? What causes some people to become terrorists?
This question has been debated for a long time, and generally, I think when you look at the causes of terrorism, it basically falls into two camps, and they're very interrelated. One view is that terrorism is born out of the environment in which the terrorist lives. They suffer repression, lack of job opportunities, discrimination, some kind of oppression or repression produces the terrorist mind. So in this view, the state itself lays down the conditions under which people will become terrorists. They simply get so frustrated they feel they have no other option but to resort to violence in order to achieve their objectives. The other side of the coin, though, is there is a lot of people around the world that suffer from poverty and discrimination and horrendous conditions, and yet not all people become terrorists. So the other half of the equation that we've got to keep in mind is that terrorism is a choice. People choose to become terrorists. Now, why some people choose that route and others don't, I don't think we fully understand. But we know that it may be rooted in conditions, but it's also a choice, and that people go through a very complex dehumanization process in order to become a terrorist and to engage in the kinds of violence and terrorist actions that they commit.
And generally, when we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about something that's a violent act or something that in some way harms another person. It's something of that nature.
Yes, in fact, I would extend the definition. I think a lot of terrorist acts, which would also include the threat of violence as being a terrorist act. So you may just call up the school and say, we have a bomb in the school. That's a threat of violence. That still would be considered terrorism because you're threatening physical destruction, bodily harm, the devaluation of a human.
Before this show, though, we talked a little bit about some of the people who have been leaders of various movements throughout history, and so some of those folks have not been poor at all. They have not come from humble beginnings.
That's right.
And right now, if one looks at Osama bin Laden, he is not necessarily a person who was, well, he isn't a person who was without money. So if we're just looking at that first cause that you indicated, and you gave us some other examples of people who had been leaders, can you share those with the audience?
Sure. In fact, we can relate it back, I'd say. Let's look at some of the Marxist-Leninist terrorist groups that were operating in Europe in the 1960s, the Red Army faction in Germany or the Red Brigades of Italy. There's many others that you can mention. The common characteristics of those terrorist groups operating were young, middle to upper class, highly educated college students in many cases, like Osama bin Laden, from a very privileged background, many of the terrorists we think were very educated that committed these acts in the United States recently. So it's not poverty, lack of education, or ignorance necessarily. Some very privileged, highly educated people go on to become terrorists or lead terrorist movements. Generally, leaders of left-wing movements are much more privileged than the people that they are trying to bring along with them in a revolution.
We have also, unfortunately, had to experience domestic terrorists, the awful bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. Even in our own region of the United States in the Northwest, we've certainly, I think, can label some of the groups and what they did as domestic terrorists. Order 1, Order 2, crimes were committed, bank robberies, people were murdered. Mm-hmm. So looking at domestic terrorists and now looking at this international terrorist threat, aren't there some common strategies they use? I don't want to answer the question, I want to ask the question, but I'm thinking particularly of one that you've already mentioned, and that is to try to instill in people fear and to paralyze an individual or a community. Would you just take that further and tell us about, we certainly have this data and can look at both domestically and internationally what they've tried to do?
Yeah, I think there's some very serious commonalities between domestic and international or transnational terrorism. Both groups are using the threat or use of violence in order to try to get concessions, to instill fear, to increase the perception of vulnerability in a victim and or target audience of the threat of violence. And certainly there's, all terrorists are looking for fear and vulnerability. Many of them in particular want to convey the impression that the government is weak, that they can't protect the public. Certainly domestic terrorists do that, and the international terrorists are doing that as well. And so that motive, that commonality to try to get that reaction out of the public is certainly a commonality. The means by which they engage in terrorism are also very similar. Maybe different kinds of violence acts, but bombings, assassinations, hijackings, murder, these are common tools in the terrorist repertoire. Whether international or domestic, they share a great deal in common.
So I hear from your answer that even though there's certainly violence, and there's no words to talk about how horrendous the bombing in New York and Washington D.C. where over 6,000 people lost their life. We've not ever experienced domestically from a foreign foe that many deaths at one time. And that is so terribly tragic. But now as we deal with that, I hear you saying your answer is what they don't succeed to do with even that horrendous violent act, that is bring down the government. If the general population doesn't respond in a way of going on with the life and countering it with not giving in to the fear and paralysis, they might accomplish more than they even could with their violent act. You hear what I'm
Yes,
trying
I
to say?
do. In fact, it reminds me of a quote that Shimon Peres said. I believe it was 1996 after Yitzhak Rabin, the former Prime Minister of Israel, was assassinated. He said, "It's not the violence that I fear, it's the fear that's produced by the violent." And basically what he was saying is that we as Israelis, and indeed let's generalize it to as people of freedom-loving nations, that you cannot give in to terrorism. The one thing we do know about terrorism is that they very rarely achieve their long-term strategic objectives. Very few terrorists get a state, very few terrorists overthrow a government, very few of them obtain any kind of long-term goals. If they are successful, it's in terms of these short-term tactical goals. Maybe they can get a concession out of the government, they certainly get publicity, they certainly provoke fear, but in the long run, publics pull together and resist that kind of violence. So they are very rarely successful in the long run.
One of the questions here that deals with how we respond to things, and the people of this country have been geniuses at times in crisis in the past. When the bombing took place, our pre-involvement in World War II, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, one of the military personnel, I don't know what rank he had, from Japan said that when that bombing took place, we woke up the giant. and then the results of World War II and the victory of democracy over fascism. And in this case, with this awful bombing in New York, has that turned our country's focus and attention and support to a problem that was already there, but we had not realized the magnitude of it until this happened? Has it created a more focused determination to address this problem internationally?
I think so. I think we're taking foreign policy much more seriously. Since the Cold War has ended, I think we've really been on kind of autopilot regarding American foreign policy and what we should be focusing on and what our interests are. A number of scholars in the academic community have been warning about these kinds of terrorist attacks. They've been talking about the postmodern terrorist, which is going to be a terrorist that is going to be unconstrained in terms of the level of violence that they commit, not constrained in terms of the minimization of human loss at all, and not constrained in terms of the kinds of weapons that they use to create their destruction. So there's been lots of voices in terms of terrorism, other kinds of threats in the international system, and I think that Washington paid some attention to that. But now, since we have had this incredibly horrendous event occur, I think we're waking up and taking that much more seriously, that this is not just some abstract hypothetical thing that could happen. It's real, and we need to, as Americans and the rest of the world community, pull together and figure out how to handle the crisis.
Janelle Berg.
I'm going to follow right up with that and ask you about the continuum of strategies for dealing with terrorism. I think we can start at one end with probably just negotiation and at another end with full-blown war, perhaps. Right. But can you talk a little bit about that continuum of dealing with terrorism?
Yeah, at one point or another, most states have adopted one or the other of the tactics along the continuum. I would start at the low end, not with negotiation, but doing nothing. Some people argue that what you should do with terrorism is condemn it publicly and verbally and denounce it, but take no action. With each of these tactics that I'm going to talk about, there are, of course, costs and benefits to each one, and I would encourage the viewers to think about what those costs and benefits are. So that's one. Another one that you hear quite frequently is no negotiation, that we will not negotiate with terrorists who have kidnapped our citizens and are asking for an exchange of prisoners. And there's some logic behind no negotiation, because if you negotiate, get your people back, then they take more because terrorism pays off. Another strategy that we've pursued, both bilaterally or by ourselves unilaterally and internationally, is through the use of economic sanctions. This is particularly with respect to state-sponsored terrorism in countries like Libya, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Afghanistan, that we believe sponsor and harbor terrorists on their soil. So the world community has put economic sanctions on them, hoping that the economic damage would get those countries to change their behavior. And recently, Muammar Gaddafi did, in fact, turn over the two Libyans suspected of bombing Panem 103, but it took quite a while, I think 10 years almost, for Muammar Gaddafi to change his mind. But that's another tool in the kit bag of dealing with international terrorists. One thing that President Reagan and President Clinton actually did was to bomb a country that we believed was responsible for harboring terrorists. We did that in 1986 against Muammar Gaddafi, and again in, 1998 or 1999 with Clinton, we bombed Afghanistan and Sudan. And there are some people who believe you have to meet terrorist violence with violence. Others argue that that simply escalates the violence. It doesn't do much to resolve it. But there are both sides on that equation. There's counterterrorism tactics, special forces to go and find terrorists. And then, of course, what we're doing now is full-scale, or the beginnings of a full-scale international war where we try to get rid of the regimes or replace the regimes we believe are harboring terrorists. This is different than just airstriking them. I think the Bush administration has a long-range plan here.
Isn't it rather difficult, though, when you're not fighting a country, you're fighting terrorists who may be some here and some there, and we don't have a clear vision of who the enemy is. We don't know. They may be someone who's living in our state. They may be someone who's living in our country, in other countries.
Right.
We don't have a clear vision of who they are. We've always had a clear vision of the enemy.
That's right.
In the past.
That's right. We can find Japan when they bomb us in World War II. It's hard to find Osama bin Laden and his friends. And that, I think, makes this the war against terrorism, or whatever metaphor we're going to use for the rest of our policy here, it makes it very difficult because retaliation becomes so difficult. Because as you pointed out, where do they live? Who are they? It's not clear who you should actually punish for these particular acts, which makes deterrence very, very difficult if you cannot threaten a particular entity with punishment if you don't know where they are.
Along that line, a little bit, shifting gears a little bit, but from my observations of this particular situation, I'm certainly no expert. Everyone has an opinion, but I'm very humble in the sense that I know that this is an incredible challenge ahead. But one thing that President Bush and the Democratic and Republican leaders of Congress have done that I think is very, very meaningful, and they've recognized this serious threat and how serious it is. But at the same time, they've made it clear, and President Bush visited the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., that we want to focus on those who are guilty, but not punish the innocent. And I think that is a policy that has been very sophisticated, and it means a lot. One thing on this program I've been pleased today, we've never said anything about the terrorist, this relation to a religion, whatever. So I'd like to get your reaction to the fact of how our government, the President and the Congress, have tried to make it clear. In fact, the President of the United States has used the term that Osama bin Laden and others have tried to hijack their religion, and I think that's a very powerful statement. How would you react to that, which is somewhat different in some times in the past when we were struggling and fighting for our survival? We tried to broad brush everyone from that racial or ethnic background.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with your assessment. I think the Bush administration has been incredibly sophisticated in dealing with this particular issue. I mean, they've been very sensitive to the loss of life of non-combatant innocent civilians. We've begun a humanitarian relief mission, and so we really have gone the extra mile to try to convey that the United States is not against Islam, but we are against terrorists, whatever stripe or background they have. It's terrorism and violence that we are against. And I think it helps in easing the mind of some of our Islamic allies who may perceive the United States as going after them. I think the Bush administration is very sensitive and has done a good job in conveying this. We have been criticized fairly severely in some circles for our behavior during the Cold War, where we supplied military and economic assistance to incredibly brutal regimes that just terrorized their own populations. And I think we're trying to distance ourselves and move away from that. There's much more sensitivity and awareness to human life and freedom, and this is what America stands for.
That brings me to another question. Take this back to last week's show in a way. Again, I show my humility because this kind of problem is far beyond my mental ability to understand or suggest solutions to. But it seems like throughout our foreign policy history, we've had a dilemma when we were struggling against communism, and in the case of Nazism under Hitler and others. You have a strategic country that's nearby. Maybe you need their airfields or whatever. That you're like now when we're dealing with these terrorist units. And you realize that the government that is in power at that time is not a democratic government, but you desperately need those avenues and those channels to deal with a more immediate problem. Hasn't this been a problem throughout our history? And I guess I have some certainly sympathy with how a government has to deal with the more immediate problem, and not, or how much do you try to internally intervene in the domestic relations of another country?
No, it's a very difficult trade-off, and I think an especially difficult trade-off for any president that held power during the Cold War era. Supporting the Shah of Iran or Somoza of Nicaragua was seen as the lesser of two evils. We simply could not allow these countries to be taken over by communists, which we saw which we perceive to be the absolute worst of all scenarios. And we know, in retrospect, the life of the average citizen under a communist regime was not particularly wonderful. I mean, they lived in fairly oppressive conditions. So in some sense, I think we're kind of right in the way we characterize them. But that also meant, as you pointed out, that we had to make deals with some very shifty, shady characters who did not uphold the human rights of their own citizens. So for short-term expediency, we may have, in fact, paid a long-term price in terms of the development of nationalism in these countries and anti-American sentiment. So for a short-term gain in the long run, it may have undermined these regimes and destabilized them to the point where we lost a key ally or friend. But that was the trade-off that was made at the time, and hopefully we can repair those relations.
Yeah. On the other side of that coin, however, by some of those relationships we had with some rather savory characters might have also assisted us in our struggle during the Cold War. Although I think there's a real legitimate argument that can be made that someone like Gorbachev himself was maybe the most influential person on this planet to helping dismantle communism when he brought in perestroika and glasnost. And in fact, he, in his own way, introduced a lot of change. And so, again, I'm back to the complexity. I don't have all the answers, but I just get your reaction to that again. Do we sometimes, Vice President Cheney has said this recently, that sometimes you have to deal with something that is unpleasant to deal with a greater unpleasant situation.
Do I agree with that statement?
I didn't ask you necessarily agree with it or not, but it's just that sometimes you're in between a hard rock and what's the saying?
Rock and a hard place.
Rock and a hard place.
Right. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways the American administration has seen themselves in that position for a long time, and whether we think it's right or not, or whether there are alternatives, I think it's debatable. I mean, I think you could argue there were alternatives to what we did, but for a great many reasons, American administrations tend to perceive the world as either or. Sometimes we have this tendency to dichotomize, and so we do see these trade-offs.
It's kind of back to Janelle's question, too, I think, on the first show, and that is, or you respond to her in a way that there are times, this can happen in people's lives, too, and it can happen in families and things. Sometimes you're in a crisis management mode, and you don't have the luxury of doing long-range plans, and that can happen to individuals, it can happen to countries.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we've been in crisis mode now for over a month, and so we've been, in the process, though, we've been rekindling relationships with states that we really haven't had much dialogue with for a while. So there actually could be a lot of new progress made in this front. So even though that we may temporarily be allied with regimes that we wouldn't consider ideal from a democratic standpoint, isolating them also does not promote the cause of freedom. If we open that dialogue, perhaps we're all going to be made better off in the long run because of this.
Then my final question before going back to Janelle would be that both the President of the United States and leadership in both parties in Congress, as you said a minute ago, it's been sophisticated, and it's been, the best term I think that's been used is it's been a measured response, carefully analyzed, much more so than normally happens in these kind of crises.
That's hard to say, because I'm trying to think of a case where the Congress was so involved in a particular crisis. If you think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Mayaguez incident in 1975 or the Iranian hostage situation, the Congress was fairly silent. This is new in that because this was an attack on America, the Congress had to get involved as well. And so I think I think they have been careful, and I think it's a real show of solidarity and the seriousness of what has occurred. I think Congress, some members of Congress realize that some of the things they were debating seem almost trivial at this point, that they need to come together and speak really with one voice. We need to show unity, and I think our politicians are incredibly aware of that need for unanimity in speaking with one voice.
I apologize, Janelle, but this just came up from your comment. It's been reported in the media that the great heroes that brought down the plane in Pennsylvania did not allow the terrorists to use that plane as a weapon. Those men did that, will always be heroes. But it was, one of the rumors was that it was headed for Washington, D.C. to attack either the White House or the Capitol. So would that not partially explain why the Congress would get so deeply involved and be such unity? Because both in New York and Washington, D.C., we were under attack.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be part of it too, that this wasn't just an isolated part of America that was being attacked. I mean, this was the whole American government. So yeah, I think that's a plausible view on what also accounts for the incredible bipartisan spirit in this country.
Janelle Berg.
To an extent, there has been terrorism of one type or another throughout history, but at earlier times, it was not possible for people to know about all the terrorism that was going on everywhere. And today we have almost instant reporting of terrorist activities. How much do you think that lends to the almost to the goal of terrorists, if it is indeed to frighten people? Because it used to be that people might not know for a long time that something had happened.
There has been various studies on the impact of the media on terrorism. And the precise studies don't come to mind, but the findings are this, that in general, the more media coverage, the more likely terrorist attacks are down the road. So there's a positive link between the amount of media coverage and the frequency with which terrorists act in the future. So you're right, you have this transmission process through the printed media. Television is even more vivid because you can see right in front of your eyes what's going on. Terrorists need that theater, they want that drama, and the media provide it for them. Now, here's the tough question. In a democratic society, can we censor the media and say don't show these images, even though the effect might be positive in terms of perhaps reducing the amount of terrorism? I believe Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s was contemplating shutting down the media, or maybe she did, but there was a huge outcry that in a democratic society we are constrained from doing certain things to get terrorists because we do live in a democratic society with certain freedoms.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. The clock wins on this program, as you would know, Lisa. Thank you for being with us this 2 weeks. You have been so informative, and I know our viewers have information they would not have had without you as our guest. We thank you again very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, our guest has been Dr. Lisa Carlson, a professor of political science at the University of Idaho. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will be moving to another subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.